it used to be the prevailing wisdom that you shouldn't sell to developers, that developers wouldn't pay for anything, and that, selling to developers is just like a really terrible way to go to market. Companies like Twilio and obviously like companies like MongoDB and Elastic and Mule have proven that developers are one of the most important, if not the most important constituent in any company today.
Hello, we are back with another episode of Business Logic. I'm your host, Andy Chin. My guest this month is Chetan Puttagunta, a general partner at Benchmark Capital. This interview is split into two parts. In the first part, we talk strategy. We identify things that are rapidly changing in the technology industry and how best to respond. Specifically, things like recruiting an executive team in a highly competitive talent market, how to deal with the rising costs of running a software company, and how to build a great remote working culture, where Chetan draws from his experience as a board member in Sketch and Elastic, both 100% fully remote companies. In the second half of this interview, we dive into Chetan's personal origin story, including how he went from app developer to software investor. What makes Chetan so effective is that the way he thinks is completely unburdened by past successes and past failures. He appreciates how every company's playbook to success is unique. One theme that I notice in his responses is that he avoids reasoning by proxy. So as an example, he discusses his refusal to let an obsession with popularized business metrics distract from the actual underlying business narrative. So without further ado, let's get into it. Chetan Puttagunta, welcome to Business Logic.
Thanks for having me, Andy. It's great to be one of your seed interviewees and get it on the show early.
Absolutely. You have to get in early so that the next round is even better.
That's right.
So we are here at the Benchmark San Francisco office. This is kind of a storied venture capital firm, and it's unusual in a lot of ways, which I will kind of want to describe to the listener in case the listener hasn't heard of Benchmark before. But Benchmark is unusual in that, for one, there are only 5 partners. You are one of them. All the economics are shared equally across all 5. And there have been some pretty phenomenal returns from a relatively modest fund size. So these are all things you can read up on Wikipedia, you can read it in business news. But I'm curious from your perspective as the newest general partner at Benchmark, what makes it a special place for you?
Yeah, look, I think the close-knit partnership at Benchmark where, like you said, it's 5 partners, 5 equal partners with a pure dedication to the craft of venture capital, which is that we take the job extraordinarily seriously and believe that it is our job to help founders build great, long-standing independent companies. And that requires a level of attention and effort against that mission that requires the 5 of us to be focused on that more than anything else. And so we think of our jobs as helping the founders scale versus helping ourselves scale. And so as a result of that, every time we invest, we take a board seat, we spend a lot of time with founders working on all sorts of projects, strategy, recruiting, whatever they need from us. And so it's a framework and a dedication to the craft that I find to be very, very unique in our ecosystem.
And when did you join this partnership?
I joined July 2018.
So about a year and a half ago, roughly.
That's right.
And so in your career before that, I just want to call out that there have been a lot of household name for developer companies that you've invested in. I count 4 exits over $1 billion between the likes of Elastic, the company behind Elasticsearch, MuleSoft, MongoDB, and a handful of others. Maybe you could start us off by telling us how you got to know those companies so early on, and what does greatness look like when you find it so early?
I've been incredibly lucky to be associated with those particular companies, and they have created really amazing products for developers that have empowered innovation in a way that that's really, really satisfying to me as a failed developer myself. And, we've chatted before about, the struggles I had personally when, I tried to create apps on my own and not having sort of the technology advantages that those that worked at, companies like Google and Facebook had, whether it was 5, 10 years ago, whatever it was. And the developer empowerment that these companies have enabled is really outstanding. And it's something that I'm personally very, very proud of. Um, as a story, each one has its own unique story of how I met the founder and how, you go about convincing the founder that they should trust you and that they should let you partner with them. But I think the overarching sort of theme across all of them is that they all were products that I wish I had. And they were all products that I knew that those that wanted to create would want. And so that's the underlying theme across all of them, is that I knew that developer empowerment was going to be huge. And I knew that, over time, technology that enabled agility, enabled speed, was going to really unleash a wave of creativity that was going to be super important to the technology ecosystem. And that was what was so attractive. And, you get to cross paths with people like Elliot, Ross and Greg, and Shai and Steven. You just are enamored with what they're doing and their mission. And you join the journey and you serve as a board member, and it's an impact that's really, really special.
So I know you like to invest in these things on the earlier side. I'm curious, when you first came across, say, an Elastic or a Mongo, what stage was the product in? Was it kind of only a PowerPoint deck? Had kind of the library already been released on GitHub and maybe had a few stars? How did you know that it'd be something great?
Yeah, in both Elastic and Mongo cases, the projects had been out for a couple of years. Both had revenue, though early, single-digit millions in sort of like run rate revenue. The primary thing that was really interesting about both companies is the users of the projects, who was using them and what they were using them for. Early on, those that were using Elasticsearch used to talk about how it was a huge competitive advantage and how it was leveling the playing field for them and was sort of increasing their ability to release products and deliver customer experience that was really, really great. And they were pulling Elasticsearch into really interesting use cases. Obviously, like logging and making sense of machine data was an easy use case for an obvious use case for Elasticsearch, but also delivering really great front-end experiences was something that people were using it for. People were using it for things like analytics. And the analytics use case was particularly interesting because they were mashing up data from multiple data silos and making sense of it in a more real-time sense. And then in the Mongo case, you just saw these properties that were hitting internet scale really, really quickly being built on MongoDB. And, it was a rough couple of years there because they were going through the growing pains of releasing a really stable and sophisticated database. And, we often talk about how it takes about 10 years to build a really good database. And so in year 4 or 5, 6, there's going to be some growing pains. But at the same time, you saw at the core what people were using it for. And they were willing to deal with the growing pains because of the amount of flexibility and agility it offered you as an app developer. So it was really cool to watch that and see the evidence of that coming up pretty early on. And, the sort of thought around developer monetization has changed pretty dramatically in the last 8 years. It used to be the prevailing wisdom that you shouldn't sell to developers, that developers wouldn't pay for anything, and that, selling to developers is just like a really terrible way to go to market. And, it's pretty laughable now that people used to think that, or even that the majority of people used to think that. And now, obviously where you work and what you all have done, the amazing things you've done at Stripe and like companies like Twilio and obviously like companies like MongoDB and Elastic and Mule have proven that developers are one of the most important, if not the most important constituent in any company today. And empowering them to be more efficient and productive is the best way to create a really great business in enterprise software today. And that's something that we as Benchmark continue to be focused on and continue to invest along those lines.
There's so much to unpack there. For one, I think you hinted at your own background as a developer yourself. So I can't wait to talk about that, I guess, later in this interview. But I deeply resonate with this kind of building for the builders sort of company. I do work at Stripe, where that's largely part of the premise. And so I think that's incredibly exciting. And I want to, I guess, step back a bit and talk about our industry to start off this interview. So maybe to give like some background, right now, a lot of venture firms like Benchmark are getting a ton of spotlight. They have press teams and media teams nowadays. And just the other day, I got a recruiting email where the headline was the firm that invested. And then only in the body of the email did it say that this is the startup that I'm trying to recruit you for. So it's really gotten way out of whack from my point of view. But I'm curious about yours. How much of this spotlight is deserved?
I think ultimately companies are going to use whatever technique to break into your inbox and get you to pay attention to the email. And perhaps they had done some research on your podcast and decided that was the best way to get your attention. And so I think it's hard to generalize on what's happening. I would say that ultimately, when a company or a startup is looking to hire really great talent, they're going to have to compete on the merits of the mission of the product and the mission of the company itself. And you may be able to get an initial response using whatever tactic you want to use, but ultimately it's going to come down to the people at the company and what they're building. And I think what you're seeing in the ecosystem is that it's a very, very competitive time. It's a very competitive time in my industry, in venture capital. It's a very competitive time. It's a very competitive time in the startup world as founders try to recruit great talent. It's a competitive time for engineers. It's a competitive time for sales executives, marketing executives, finance executives, product teams, designers. It's simply a time of great innovation in the Valley. You know, there's, as you see every day, lots of new companies being born, lots of great products being created. And as a result, everybody here has a lot of options. And ultimately, to get talent to come join your company, you're going to have to be working on something that's really appealing to somebody. And so regardless of what the initial hook is, ultimately, it's going to be about the mission of the product that you're building. And so, you know, I think that I would always encourage anyone trying to recruit to lead with that and lead with trying to create a connection with who you're trying to hire around what you're trying to build. Spend a lot of time creating a really great, sustainable culture inside the company that will enable you to grow efficiently, properly, and create a culture that where people want to come to work every single day. Mm-hmm. Like ultimately, I think you want to create a company that, you know, if things work out, you get to be independent forever, which is amazing, right? And that's the dream for every company we back. We want every company we back to create a really amazing, sustainable, profitable business that allows it to be independent forever. And when you have that goal, you want to create that sustainability and enable those that are joining to really enjoy coming to work.
When it comes to thinking about setting up your company for success in that way, it seems like there are a lot of factors and a lot to unpack in what you said. There was kind of the recruiting angle, also the culture angle, and how to make that great. There's plenty of material to work with here, but maybe we can start with recruiting. As I understand, it's a big part of your job to make sure that your portfolio companies are staffed with the best people in the world and what they do. Not all of us, I guess, who are listening to the show are the ones in charge of hiring our C-level executives. But suppose they are. Suppose we're talking to the founder right now. What advice would you give in that vein of how to recruit an excellent management team?
Yeah. Number one, make sure you work with Benchmark. No, joking aside, I think you're absolutely right that it is probably the activity that I spend the most amount of time on is helping our founders recruit talent and recruit especially management talent. That is probably the number one task that I spend the most amount of effort on. It is not an easy process. And I think the appreciation that I've gained over time is that it's really hard to take shortcuts through that in terms of like recruiting really great managers, really great VP of sales, VP of marketing, VP of engineering, VP of product, whatever it is. The people that you want working at your company that are going to help propel you forward know that they have a lot of options in the world and know that they're in demand at the moment. And so, one, you have to create a connection there where they want to work on whatever you're working on, one. And two, establish a trust that the company that they join is going to be around for a long time and that it's a great place to build their next phase of their career. And so, number one, I think you ultimately have to be very, very specific for who you're looking for and what you're looking for. What are exactly the specific skills and functions that the person you're looking to hire is going to be doing inside your company? Specific, like being very specific about what's ahead enables, one, the person looking at the job to really understand if it's a good fit or not, one. And two, once that person joins your company, will understand exactly what the expectations are once they join. And so it's a two-way communication there that really clarifies the role, clarifies expectations. I think that's like the very, very first step of designing something for success is spending a lot of time like actually writing down what you're looking for, who you're looking for, and what they're going to be doing. That's number one. And number two, of course, generating top of the funnel, generating a lot of candidates. And there are a lot of techniques to doing that. And then having a really great recruiting process when somebody engages. I really think it's important when people engage with your company and you decide you want to interview somebody to show the appropriate level of enthusiasm, to be very structured in terms of the process itself, not be haphazard, follow up, schedule on time, and when the meetings and interviews are scheduled, make sure that people are showing up on time for that. And just making sure that the company is being very transparent and doing a really good job of making the candidate feel respected during the interview process itself. And making sure that as they move through the process, that you're giving them feedback about where they stand in the process. And if at some point you just decide that this is not a fit, being really transparent there too and saying, look, like, we're going to part ways here. And so just being really fair and being transparent and being upfront and structured in the process is really important. I also think that outlining ahead of time as you go through an interview process of like, what are actually the checkpoints and how do we get there? Really critical. And then finally, the point that I think is perhaps not taken that seriously, especially in competitive markets, is references. I really think that doing reference checks on who you're about to hire is super important. Obviously, you have to call everybody they give you on their reference list. And I personally think it's a really good idea to get back channel references and find references on your own. And obviously, you want to be really sensitive to the person you're recruiting about who you can and can't call. And so what I think is a totally reasonable thing to ask is say, you've given me a list of references. Can I go find some references on my own? And if so, sort of, are there limitations? Who knows that you're recruiting? If they say, look, like, please don't call anybody at my current company, then obviously you stay away from that. And, they say, well, but like, the company before that, feel free to call somebody there. So being very upfront that you're going to do references, you're going to do the references that they give you and also the back channel references, super important to do those references. And making sure that when you do those references, you're not doing them with confirmation bias, that you're actually listening to what the other person is saying. And one of the things that I find when doing references is that once in a while, there'll be coded sentences there There'll be gaps. And then, you can just ask, like, are you trying to tell me something that I'm not able to interpret here? And those references ultimately will give you a lot of information. And I think a lot more information than even the interview process will. And so, but all three of those components are super critical as you're competing for great talent. So, one, designing a great job description, understanding exactly who you're looking for, what you're recruiting for, what the job will entail. Two, running a really great structured process. And then three, references. So when those three things come together, it leads to a lot of successful searches.
Seems like a theme that we've been coming across here is that things are very competitive. I think I'm actually learning things from this interview. That is that venture capitalists, at least here at Benchmark, are not just a source of capital and corporate governance in the form of a board seat, but also you can put them to work apparently to help recruit for you. That's news to me. I'm curious, what else or how else would you advise putting your investors to work for you?
So look, every venture capitalist is going to bring a unique skill set to the table, and they're going to have certain areas where they have expertise in. There's also going to be a certain amount of time they can dedicate to a certain effort. Like we talked about, I spend a lot of time helping with recruiting. Obviously, I also spend a lot of time in terms of thinking about go-to-market. And that comes from experience of having seen companies scale over and over again from single digits, 0 to single digits to hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue. And so as a result of that, that's the service and the business partnership that gets established between me and the founder when I'm on the board. I think every venture investor is different. And as a founder, when raising capital, one, it's really important to understand exactly how, your new board member is going to behave on the board and what they're going to be spending time focusing on. And the other thing that I think, we talked about referencing new hires. You should absolutely reference your venture capitalists before you let them join your board. And one of the things that I tell founders is, look, I can give you a list of references of founders I've worked with. And if you'd like, you can call somebody else too. Like if you'd like to back channel me, that's great too. And so referencing your board members is super important. And much like hiring a new executive that you're committing to, similarly, a company is going to commit to a board member. And it's super important to do those references. And so you can learn a lot from those references. You can learn about, what has this person helped you with? How's this person acted when things have gone well? How's this person been on your board when things have gone poorly? And all those are really informative when making that decision.
So when it comes to our industry, I'm curious, why are software companies getting so expensive to start? Like companies these days that are software companies are raising rounds, they're seed rounds that resemble yesterday's B rounds. They're just taking so much money, and this is extremely curious in the light of things like public clouds like Amazon Web Services, which makes servers as cheap as a cappuccino a month, or all these open source frameworks that, now the big companies are sort of releasing their once proprietary technology such that any person can start for free. So things seem like they should be getting cheaper than ever. Why are things getting more expensive than ever?
It's a paradox, isn't it? Everybody likes to talk about how it's cheaper than ever to start a company. And then you step back and you look at how much capital is being consumed today by software companies, get to scale, and you sit there and you say, well, this looks really different. This looks really different than what was going on in the 80s or 90s and how much capital it was taking to get to $100 million of revenue. I think there's a lot that goes into it. I think looking at just the infrastructure spend is an incomplete picture. I think ultimately, one, overall competition for talent, like we talked about, has gone way up. And so simply what you have to pay to attract great talent, regardless of where they sit in the world, I just don't think there's that much of an arbitrage left in the world. There's maybe a little bit here or there, and there's still pockets of arbitrage, but look, like if you're going to hire great talent in the United States, and especially engineering, remote work is now pretty standard. And if you're looking to hire a remote developer, that remote developer is going to have 10 to 15 options. And so overall, I think the cost of talent has gone up, which ultimately I actually think is a good thing. I think sharing the economics of a successful startup with all your employees is an absolute right thing to do. And so the overall cost of attracting great talent has gone up. And then two, I think selling, especially in software startups, is becoming more expensive every day. And so that's a part of the ecosystem that I actually spend a lot of time thinking about, is the cost of customer acquisition and how to drive that as close to zero as possible. What are the things you can do in the product itself where you can push CAC to zero? And I think ultimately what's been happening is that as you stray away from focusing on CAC, that comes in different forms. It comes in the form of really expensive sales and marketing. It comes in the form of like really expensive hidden expenses inside the company that makes your cash burn really, really high. So I think one, the paradox is, well, all these cloud companies and all this cloud infrastructure should make starting a startup really, really inexpensive. What's going on? I think the other side of it is, one, acquiring great talent is expensive and you have to pay market rates. And two, cost of customer acquisition is continuing to go up as competition increases. So as a result of that, what can you do to drive that to be as low as possible?
I think you've referenced a playbook maybe a couple times now. That is, it sounds like having seen something like the companies you've been involved with grow from this kind of organic, self-serve, almost viral usage to, I guess, established usage in large enterprises. How much is that playbook changing over time?
It changes constantly. I think it's every iteration of it is completely different, right? Strategies that worked 5 years ago are not going to work today. And it's this market theory that like whatever little gap you find in the market that you then take advantage of becomes known, and then that advantage just basically disappears and you have to go find the next one. So the one advantage that is inherent in software that I think will persist is if you just make a really, really great product that delivers amazing value to your user and they want to tell their friends about it, that value itself will persist for a long time. I just think delivering high quality products to your users that delight and make them really productive to the point that they're then promoting the product to their friends, to their colleagues, etc. And you're getting this, like you said, like this virality in enterprise products. And it shows up in multiple places, right? It will show up in infrastructure software. If you have an open source tool that makes somebody really productive, they're going to tell people about it. And then when they have a great project, they're going to want to come to the open source meetup and give a talk about it. And those activities really end up lowering your cost of customer acquisition pretty dramatically. And so, I've talked about this publicly before, which is that I think that recently there's been a huge over-rotation towards being metrics driven as a technology business, which for me makes no sense. If you're a technology business, the reason you got started is because you believe that there's a gap in the market for a product and a technology. And so you've started to build a product in technology. And all of a sudden, when you get to some ARR number or some run rate number, you're supposed to now be looking at like LTVs and CACs and this ratio and that number and this number. And that's how you should be sort of like governing the spend levels and the dials. And that's always puzzling to me. And I just reject that construct because you started the company as a technology company. You started the company as a product company. You can't move to this metric-driven company. I think you have to continue to focus on the product. You have to continue to focus on the use cases, continue to focus on delivering value to customers. And that's the only way to do it. And over time, it lets you build really efficient go-to-market motions I think this being like completely metric driven and dialing it to one way or the other, it essentially makes you lose touch with the customer. And you're no longer delivering customer experience or customer value. You're literally optimizing for some ratio that says, I put in this much money into marketing and sales and this much revenue comes out. How that revenue, came to you, like it's hard to capture in metrics, right? And so I think that's the trap that a lot of startups fall into.
So we've talked about a couple of the ingredients in terms of the cocktail of what makes a great company. One is excellent people via great recruiting. Yet another, as we just talked about, is having a product that makes people want to tell their friends about it. Maybe a third one that we haven't yet fully covered is what makes a great culture. And I think maybe the most interesting lens on this is how to build a great remote culture. So as you said, everyone has options. Even the remote developer who's not necessarily located here in the United States, they have plenty of companies that will take them nowadays and can get paid a very competitive salary no matter where they are. In your own experience, and I see that you invested in Sketch, which is, I understand, a fully remote or more or less fully distributed company. What have you seen work really well with respect to building a great culture where people are not physically co-located?
Yeah, so Sketch is 100% remote. Elastic's engineering team is also 100% distributed. And both are, they're meaningful sized organizations with, meaningful revenue at this point. I would say that both companies did something really, really well, which is that they were essentially remote and distributed cultures from day one. And so as a result of that, they established a workflow and a way of working that's very remote friendly from day one. So just in terms of how they go about working on a project with multiple people and how they communicate with each other in terms of what's expected and timelines and how much they're writing down, like internal documentation, the importance of internal documentation, I think goes up by a factor of 10 when you can't walk over and ask somebody, hey, what were you thinking when you wrote this module? What's the input here? What's the output here? They're like, it's not really making sense to me. When you can't do that, you have to rely a lot on what's being written down and the documentation. And so the documentation of the exercises inside the company become 10x more important. So how do you take notes of meetings? How do you share meeting notes? How do you really communicate the mission of the company? How do you really communicate different changes that you're doing? A town hall takes a very different look in a company where, let's say it's 100 people and everybody's remote. A town hall is then like a Google Hangout where everybody's dialing from their desk, right? And so ordering that and having an efficient town hall is really different than having 100 people in a room, because you can say, oh, does anybody have questions? And then you have people raising their hands and you can kind of see who's raising their hands. Whereas that's not how it works, 100% Google Hangout. So from day one, understanding that some of the paradigms that you have when everybody's in one office are not going to work when you move to a fully distributed organization. I think a lot of people then say, okay, well, if I'm going to go remote, what are the software tools that I need? And so they immediately jump into, let me think about the remote work software stack. And what I say to that is, look, remote companies were built way before any of these tools existed, and they did great. And so it's not about the remote work software tool that's going to enable you to be really good at remote work. It's actually about the culture itself. And that culture starts with this culture of transparency and being able to communicate exactly what's going on in different pockets of the company and pushing that knowledge out to everybody and making that knowledge really, really accessible and creating systems where that exists. So a very simple example is having a really rich company wiki that's alive and that's constantly updated every day, such that anybody in the company can go into the wiki and see exactly what are the 3 big projects that any functional group is working on. And so having a culture of that level of transparency is pretty key to being successful as a remote company.
Stepping back a bit, back to our industry, there's a lot of scrutiny right now on the technology industry. A lot of kind of very public sort of failures that you get the sense that there's a lot of schadenfreude going on. I want to maybe turn that narrative a little bit here and, from your point of view, get a dose of optimism. What should we celebrate more that is happening?
We talk about it a lot here at Benchmark, which is that simply the volume and magnitude of innovation that's happening is simply incredible. The overall enthusiasm of entrepreneurs working on really cool projects around the world is at an all-time high. There is so much opportunity around the world to create great businesses that you can start a company literally anywhere in the world, and you can access talent, really great talent all around the world, and build an incredible company. Like you said, Sketch is a 100% remote company. The CEO of Sketch lives in The Hague in the Netherlands. The co-founder lives in Porto, Portugal, and the COO lives in Silicon Valley. Elastic, which is a really big public company now, originated out of Amsterdam, and most of the management team now is in Mountain View, and they have offices all over the world. They have a really incredible team distributed all throughout the world. So tons and tons of examples of that, of innovation starting anywhere and then grabbing talent all over the world to build something really extraordinary and meaningful. I do think that the level of talent concentrated here in Silicon Valley is higher than anywhere else. And so what I say is, regardless of where you start the company, I still think it's important to access the talent market here. And that's where we spend a lot of time helping our founders that are not located here, is getting access to the talent that's in Silicon Valley. The number, simply the sheer number of people that have gone through these journeys of going from zero to $1 billion of revenue, the concentration of that is here. And getting, a couple of people that have been through that journey and have seen the ups and downs along that path of that journey is a huge advantage and increases the clock speed of your company. And so I really encourage everybody to access the talent pool that's available in Silicon Valley, regardless of where your company is based or where it started.
I love that answer. I think there's something else that I think you mentioned, not here, but on your Twitter. So I really want to dig in on this one. You mentioned that you have talked to a lot of people who are just entering the technology industry, and you've learned a lot of things that make you very excited for the future as well. I'm curious if you'd be willing to share anything that you learned from here, and why you sort of did that exploration in the first place.
This is something that I do constantly, and I say that I make it a really big point to make sure that I meet with people that are entering the technology ecosystem and the venture ecosystem, just now. I think that those that are just entering the ecosystem are going to see the gaps and the inefficiencies much clearer than those that have been here for a long time, that have been sort of in the ecosystem and have figured out a way to navigate the ecosystem, and kind of point out the inefficiencies and kind of point out like a new way of thinking around existing problems. I find that fresh approach to be super invigorating and energizing. And so I make it a point that, anyone entering, especially the VC ecosystem, reach out. And, I am constantly looking to learn from those that are just entering the ecosystem, because I think they have a lot of insight that is really, really spectacular and special, because they're seeing things at a level that are not going to be apparent if you've been in the industry for 5-10 years. And the enthusiasm and energy they have for the process and the founders, it's also super infectious. And their networks that they have coming into the industry are going to be very different than the networks that those that have been in the industry for a long time have. So as a result of that, the partnership opportunities that are available by meeting those that are just entering the ecosystem, just awesome. I think it's just a really important thing to focus on And it's something that I do, in the venture capital ecosystem, but it's something that I encourage everybody to do, regardless of your industry. If you're a developer working in fintech, you should be meeting the new people starting new things in fintech, because they're going to be identifying things that are going to be really cool. They're going to be identifying gaps that aren't really apparent to you. If you're a developer working on infrastructure, you should be doing the same thing. So I think meeting those that are just entering your industry is a really great way to keep learning.
I want to talk a little bit about you personally, Chetan, because I don't think there is as much known about who Chetan is as the person behind the great investments. Maybe we could start with the fact that you were an engineer at one point. You studied engineering, built a few apps, and now you're an investor. When it came to making that pretty large career decision, what factors went into it?
I don't know that I had a master plan that I was following. I think ultimately what I was driven by was working with really great people on really interesting projects and really interesting problems. And so that's always been the primary motivation. And like you said, worked on a lot of things that just didn't work. And so, it became very clear to me that others were much better at creating than I was, and that I had to find my role in a different place. And it just so happened that it clicked for me in venture as an investor. And I feel super fortunate to have that opportunity and to be able to work with these incredibly motivated and visionary founders that want to build something really spectacular. And it's an incredibly rewarding job. And so I'm super fortunate to have had that opportunity to do what I'm doing. I think ultimately the transition from engineering or operating to investing is something that a lot of people do. And I got some great advice really, really early on in my career, which is that as investors, our job is to listen 99% of the time. Is to just listen. And then the other part of it is that you hire operators and you hire executives and you back founders, and your job is to support them and let them do their job, right? If you're going to hire a VP of sales, you would never go in and sell yourself. That defeats the purpose of hiring somebody to run sales. And similarly, I think that, when you're an investor, that sort of, if you come from operating or you come from building, that temptation to grab onto the steering wheel and just letting it go, right? It's just you're backing a group of people because you trust them and you love what they're working on and you really appreciate their vision. So stepping away from that and trusting them to go through that journey is something that I see a lot of people that are very successful operators grapple with when they're going and investing. They say like, well, I would actually do it this other way. And in a way, I'm extraordinarily fortunate to not be burdened by that, because I know that I couldn't have built it myself, because I failed. Like I wasn't able to build, the great apps. The apps that I was working on just didn't turn into anything. And I also think that makes me a bit more empathetic in terms of just like the struggle itself. Like it's hard. It's hard out there. It's hard to build. It's hard to create. And the number of times you're confronted with the prospect of failure as a startup founder is constant. And so as a board member and as a business partner, your job then is to be very supportive and to think about, what are the blind spots coming up? How do you help navigate them around those? How do you best prepare them for the challenges that are ahead? And being really mindful of that.
I want to dig in on sort of your own origin story even further. I know you mentioned publicly before that one of your favorite books is Shoe Dog, which is, I'm a big sucker for that type of business biography book as well. I'm curious, in the beginning of the book, you sort of see a young Phil Knight have a moment of clarity when it came to what his purpose was. And it was something along the lines of play and sport and not necessarily even shoes, just a spirit, like kind of an ethos. Did you have a moment like that yourself when you sort of knew that investing and maybe more specifically venture investing was for you?
It's really interesting. Like you're right that I really enjoyed Shoe Dog, and that moment of clarity is a really interesting concept. And Phil Knight in his book talks a lot about how athletes feel it too. There's this like moment that like literally determines winning or losing, and it's the micro decisions you make in the like 1 second, and talks about that clarity you feel just around those moments. What's really interesting about investing is that you don't have this immediate feedback loop. So if you're playing sports, you either make the shot or you don't, or you either win the race or you don't. But the feedback loop in investing is much, much longer. So you invest in a company and you really don't know if it's going to work or not going to work for 5, 7, 10 years. And that timeline gets extended if there's a pivot along the way or two, right? And so the feedback loop around that is very, very different. And so I think one of the things that is different than that moment of clarity that you get in investing is actually almost the polar opposite, which is that you really associate yourself with a purpose and you're driven by a mission or a trend that really pulls you. And for me, like I said before, it's really about working with great people, working on products that I personally resonate with, that I find to just be really cool. And it takes a lot of forms. And so, and the other part that I think is relevant is just being open to learning all the time and open to new ideas and being open to being surprised. I think if you go into any discussion saying, I really like this market, I'm looking for an investment here, or I have a way of thinking about XYZ solution, you limit yourself from being surprised, and you limit yourself from being really open to really creative builders. And I think part of what I really enjoy, that I've enjoyed in the founders I've worked with, is that creative energy that they bring to the table and the nonlinear thinking around solving problems. And interestingly, the vast majority of people I've worked with are outsiders to an industry. They're not people that were in that industry for 25 years and saw an inefficiency and came up with something new. It's actually people that were outside the industry, saw what was happening and said, that's totally bonkers. Like there's a totally different way to think about it, and have decided to go from point A to point B by traversing a completely different plane altogether. And so this is a very long way of answering your question, which is, for me, that moment of clarity, if anything, is being open to creativity and being open to being surprised. And I think that is what I show up every day looking for, that, looking to be surprised, looking for a creative founder to show me or to talk about, hey, like everybody's been going from point A to point B this way, and I have found this completely different plane that I can use to traverse from point A to point B.
Phil Knight and Shoe Dog kind of also had other characters that helped him along the way. Not to spoil the whole book, but his old track coach was a legend who kind of elevated his previously unknown profile to someone who is legitimate. And I think you find characters like that in almost any great career. In terms of your own, who would you say has had, and maybe you can mention multiple names, but who's had kind of the biggest influence on your own thinking and in your career?
Yeah, my partner Peter has been by far the biggest influence on me in terms of understanding just how to be an effective board member. Serving on the board of Elastic with him for well over 5 years now has been an unbelievably informative experience. Number one, it's taught me that you have to come to every board meeting with what we talked about earlier, which is that your job as an investor is to be there to listen. And two, every interaction, you have to be hyper prepared, and you have to have read all the materials. You have to have all the background. You have to understand all the nuances. You have to be super engaged in terms of exactly what the founders are trying to communicate to you. I think that like just having that kind of mentorship from very early on in my career has been amazing. And, I've been really lucky throughout my career that I've come across mentors that took a chance on me and really believed in me and imparted some incredible lessons. Going all the way back to partner that I worked for at HIG Capital, Ingrid Mazul, people like John Sakota and Ravi Viswanathan, and the late great Harry Weller, who spent a lot of time one-on-one mentoring me. And so I find that there are a lot of people that I've come across that were willing to take a chance on me and spend time with me and really help me understand the nuances of the job and the craft, et cetera, that I've really, really, really benefited from. And I think that's one of the most important things that you can do as you go into an industry is seek out those mentors and seek out those that you can learn from. Bill gave this incredible talk at the University of Texas that's on YouTube that I really encourage everybody to go watch if you haven't seen it already, where he talks about all these great figures in history that really proactively went and found mentors and how that accelerated their careers. And he talks about this across multiple industries, not just, financial services. And so I've been really fortunate to have incredible mentors all throughout my career. And I think that's huge in terms of the path that everybody takes.
Thank you for sharing that, Chetan. I will absolutely link that talk of Bill Gurley's to the show notes. I think it's a fabulous one. I have listened to it. And we are approaching about that time in the interview where it's time for the lightning round. So this is, of course, a series of a few questions where typically lighthearted, typically, on the shorter side in terms of the response, and things that I've kind of picked from doing research for this interview here. So maybe we can start with your go-to Starbucks order. So I know you mentioned something about how the Starbucks app experience, there's a lot of lessons to take from
yes. You have completely outed me on your show as not being a coffee connoisseur. So thank you for that. Honestly, it like literally depends on the time of day and the season, because Starbucks actually I find to be incredibly innovative in both their customer experience, their app experience, and actually what they're serving in the locations. I really like cappuccinos, and espresso-based drinks. So any of those will do just fine. But I just find that how they've expanded into teas, into non-caffeinated drinks, and flavored drinks, and seasonal drinks to be just super delightful customer experience. And this is a funny thing to say, but I actually think that watching Starbucks and how they deliver customer experience is pretty informative to software. Like, they eliminate so many potential frustration points for customers in the overall experience of just getting a cup of coffee. But the experience is so personalized along the way that you're willing to pay a pretty incredible premium for a cup of coffee. Because you could make coffee at home, and it's
always an option.
But it's a different experience, and the overall experience of Starbucks, I think, is tremendous. So I'm just a huge fan of the company, and so yeah, the order depends, but like the cappuccino is the go-to.
Now I want to pick up some coffee after this. What about the first public stock you ever bought?
Yeah, I think it was Microsoft. It was the first public stock I ever bought. I think that, I think it was back, I actually don't remember the year, but, I think it was a company that always had a suite of products that were always super impressive. I think I remember when Windows 95 was released and how big of a deal that was, and just how much coverage it got on TV. Like this packaged software that was an operating system that people lined up for, which was so interesting, right? And in retrospect, you're just like, what was that? What a weird time. And how accessible they made everything, how Office just became this central way of people working, like, whether it was Word or Excel, and eventually PowerPoint, these tools just became central to how people worked. And then ultimately how they took over email with Outlook, very impressive. And I'd always been impressed with what Microsoft was up to. I think there was a period of time where there were a lot of things that they missed on, which I actually think was really good for the ecosystem because it allowed for new entrants. It allowed for the concentration to dissipate a bit. And over the last couple of years, they're back on the innovation treadmill, and it's incredible what they've been doing with like Azure specifically, and delivering cloud to enterprises. I think that they've gone from, almost a cold start to being a really big competitor to AWS really, really fast. And they've taken a very un-Microsoft approach to doing that, which is that they've been extraordinary partners to startups, especially in terms of helping startups offer options on top of Azure so that they can access the entire enterprise install base that Microsoft has. And that's really great. And I think Azure has been an enabler for the ecosystem. And so excited for what that company is going to do.
This last one here is kind of an unfair question, but I'll ask it anyway. Sketch versus Microsoft Paint. No, I'm just joking. Sketch versus Figma. Maybe there's a meta question there too about why is it that people feel like they have to choose and that it seems like such a dichotomy. But I'm curious which between the two.
Well, as you know, and that's why you're asking the question, I'm on the board of Sketch, and we here at Benchmark invested in Sketch and think highly of the team and what they're building. And it goes back to the theme that we talked about earlier, which was enabling the creators. And that's a big theme that I've been following throughout my career. And Sketch is just that, right? It's enabling those that are creating products. And if you look at the massive install base that Sketch has today in the world, you can definitively say that the best products are built in Sketch. And that was a really attractive value proposition for us, just from thinking about what that becomes over time. I think it's pretty apparent to everyone that design is becoming really, really important to every product. And it's a natural step, right? As every company eventually becomes more and more software oriented, the usability of that software becomes very critical to the business itself. And so as Sketch enables that, it enables every software product to aspire to be amongst a very different class of software products because of what Sketch just lets you do inside the product. And I personally just love it. It's one of those things that from the moment that I started using Sketch, you just feel like you've been handed superpowers, and you graduate, your design sensibilities just graduate to a different level when you're in that product. And I think that's super, super unique. And it's one that's a persistent advantage. And it goes back to what we're talking about, which is that how do you create a product that sells itself? And Sketch today, they've publicly talked about how they have over 1 million paying users. And the company has never had anybody in sales and marketing ever in its history. And, the company has been organically and virally consumed. And that just speaks to the incredible power of the product itself. And the more time you spend in Sketch, the more time this really becomes apparent. And so that's why I think that Sketch is just an amazing product and an amazing company. The overall design ecosystem is going through a lot of innovation right now. And it's a space that a lot of people are paying attention to. And I think a lot of investors believe in the macro trend that design and creativity and sort of unleashing the creatives is a big market opportunity. So there's lots and lots of excitement around the whole design ecosystem and all the different companies that are working in that ecosystem. So I think overall, having more companies participate in the ecosystem is a good thing. And I think that as the ecosystem gets richer, the users benefit more than anybody else because they're getting new modes of interactivity. They're getting really great features. And I also think competition's super healthy for an ecosystem. When you have strong competition, it pushes you to innovate faster. And, if you look at what Sketch has released in the last 12 months, it's incredible. And what they're now releasing basically on a weekly basis, it's amazing. It's really amazing to watch. And so I'm really excited about what Sketch is going to do over the next 12 months, over the next 2 years, over the next 10 years. I think it's a company that your users are going to hear a lot about.
Certainly. I hope we didn't just alienate half of our listeners here, but personally, I am Team Sketch all the way. It's where my first crappy designs live, and I've spent many hours in there, and I'm just so glad to see their Twitter page constantly update with new feature after new feature. It's insane.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think we are at time now. Thank you so much, Chetan, for sharing your insights and your thinking when it comes to our industry as well as your own background. If people want to follow your thinking and your work in the future, where should they go?
You can follow me on Twitter at Chetan P, and that's where I post a lot of what I'm thinking about and what's on my mind at any given point.
Wonderful. Thank you for your time, Chetan.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to Business Logic. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it among your friends. Do also rate us on whatever podcast app that you are currently using. You can get updates to the show by following us on Twitter at BusinessLogicFM. I'm Andy Chin, signing off for now. Talk to you in the next one. Cheers.